The infrared scope trembled in Staff Sergeant Marcus Valdez's grip as he watched the heat signatures converge on their position. 27 Taliban fighters moving through the ravine below, and his 8-man reconnaissance team had nowhere to run. The mountains of Afghanistan's Kunar province stretched endlessly around them, jagged peaks cutting into a starless sky like broken teeth. Radio static crackled through his earpiece, punctuated by the distant echo of AK-47 fire that seemed to bounce off every rock face. "Overwatch, this is Recon 7, Valdez whispered into his throat mic, pressing himself deeper into the limestone outcropping. "We've got movement. Multiple hostiles, approximately 2-7, advancing on our position from the southeast. Request immediate extraction." The response came through layers of static and delay. "Recon 7, Overwatch, negative on extraction. No birds available in your sector. Weather's grounded everything within 200 clicks." Valdez felt his stomach drop. The storm that had rolled in 3 hours ago wasn't just bringing rain, it was bringing death. Lightning split the darkness above, illuminating the impossible terrain that surrounded them. Steep canyon walls rose on 3 sides, leaving only one exit route, and the Taliban controlled it now. "Overwatch, we're pinned down hard. Cannot egress through primary route. These guys aren't random, they're moving with purpose, coordinated. Someone tipped them off." His voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many operations go sideways, too many good soldiers not come home. Behind him, Corporal James Rabbit Morrison adjusted his night vision goggles and counted ammunition. 7 magazines left. Private Chen worked frantically with the radio, trying to boost their signal through the canyon's natural interference. The metallic taste of fear filled the air, mixing with the smell of rain-soaked earth and gunpowder. "Sir," Chen's voice was barely audible, "I'm picking up chatter on Taliban frequencies. They're calling in reinforcements, something about a high-value target." Valdez's blood ran cold. High-value target meant they weren't here by accident. Someone had marked his team, and now they were walking into what military tacticians called a kill box, a predetermined area where the enemy concentrates overwhelming firepower. The sound of boots on loose shale echoed from below, closer now, much closer. "Overwatch, Recon 7. We need immediate air support. Anything. I don't care if it's a crop duster with firecrackers strapped to it. We're about to be overrun." Silence stretched across the radio waves, broken only by the growing sound of voices speaking in Pashto, coordinating their final assault. Then, cutting through the static like a blade, came a voice that would change everything. Calm, controlled, with just the slightest hint of a southern drawl. "Recon 7, this is Ghostwriter 77. Hold your position, we're inbound." The night sky remained empty above them, storm clouds churning like an angry sea. But somewhere in that darkness, salvation was coming. Captain Evelyn "Ghost" Sinclair banked the massive C-130J Super Hercules through turbulence that would have grounded any sane pilot. Her hands moved across the controls with the precision of a surgeon, reading the aircraft's responses like poetry written in hydraulic pressure and engine torque. The Hercules groaned against the storm, its 4 Rolls-Royce turboprops fighting through wind shear that registered red on every instrument. "Ma'am, with respect, this is insane," came the voice of Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski from the engineer's station. "We're flying through weather that's got every other aircraft on the ground. The brass said it couldn't be done." Ghost's eyes never left the heads-up display, where targeting data scrolled past in green phosphorescent lines. "Sergeant, the brass has never flown a Hercules through a sandstorm at night with one engine out and insurgents shooting RPGs at the tail. This is just weather." The cargo bay behind them held more than medical supplies and ammunition. Strapped to the deck were 2,000 pounds of precision-guided munitions, each one capable of turning the tide of a firefight. More importantly, it held hope for 8 men who were about to discover that the impossible was just another word for Tuesday in Ghost's vocabulary. Ghost Rider 77, Overwatch, crackled through her headset. Be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Recommend abort and return to base. Ghost's finger hovered over the radio transmit button. Below them, somewhere in the maze of canyons and ridgelines, American soldiers were counting their last magazines. She'd been in their position before, during the Battle of Mosul in 2016, when her unit was surrounded for 36 hours, and every prayer ended with the hope of hearing aircraft engines. Overwatch, Ghost Rider 77, negative on abort. We didn't come this far to quit because of a little rain. Her co-pilot, Major Tom Rodriguez, shot her a look that mixed admiration with concern. Ghost, I've been flying for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone thread the needle like you're about to attempt. That canyon's barely wide enough for our wingspan. Through the cockpit windows, lightning revealed the terrain below in stark, terrifying detail. The mountains rose like monuments to impossibility, their peaks disappearing into clouds that roiled with electric fury. GPS signals flickered in and out, making navigation an exercise in instinct and experience. Rodriguez, you ever see a hummingbird fly through a hurricane? No, ma'am. Neither has anyone else, but they do it anyway because that's what hummingbirds do. Ghost's voice carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd made impossible decisions before. This is what we do. The radio crackled again, this time with desperation bleeding through the static. Ghost Rider 77, Recon 7. We're taking fire from multiple positions. I count at least 40 hostiles now. If you're coming, please hurry. Ghost pushed the throttles forward, feeling the Hercules surge ahead into the storm's heart. The C-130's radar painted a picture of death in geometric shapes. Red blips clustered around a single green dot, Recon 7's position, like antibodies surrounding an infection. Ghost's tactical display showed what ground controllers couldn't see. The Taliban hadn't just stumbled onto her boys. This was a deliberate ambush, with blocking positions established at every escape route. Ghost were showing multiple SAM sites active in the valley, Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concern. SA-7s may be SA-14s. They're painting us. Surface-to-air missiles. The Taliban had upgraded their capabilities, trading AK-47s and roadside bombs for sophisticated anti-aircraft systems. Ghost felt the familiar weight of decision settling on her shoulders, the same sensation she'd experienced over Syria when her squadron was tasked with flying humanitarian supplies into a war zone that defense analysts said was unsurvivable. Recon 7, Ghost Rider 77. Paint your position with infrared strobes. We're coming in fast and low. Below them, Staff Sergeant Valdez pressed the IR beacon into Private Chen's hands. Light us up, kid. Make sure that pilot can see us through this mess. The beacon's invisible light cut through darkness that night vision turned into an alien landscape of green and black. Chen held it above his head like a technological prayer. Hopping the pilot above could perform the miracle they desperately needed. Ghost Rider, we're lit. Multiple hostiles advancing from Grid Alpha 7 through Charlie 9. They've got us bracketed. Ghost's eyes moved across her instruments, calculating variables that would determine whether 8 soldiers went home or became statistics. Wind speed, 35 knots gusting to 50. Visibility, less than half a mile. Target elevation, 7,000 feet above sea level, with mountains rising to 11,000 on all sides. Loadmaster, prepare for combat drop, she announced over the intercom. We're going in. Master Sergeant Patricia Williams had been dropping supplies into combat zones for 12 years, but she'd never attempted a precision delivery in weather like this. The cargo bay's red lights cast everything in the color of emergency as she and her team prepared pallets of ammunition, medical supplies, and hope. Ma'am, drop zones barely 200 meters wide, Williams reported. In these winds, accuracy is going to be nearly impossible. Patricia, impossible is just another word for challenge. Ghost's voice carried across the intercom with the calm authority of someone who'd redefined impossible multiple times. We're not dropping supplies, we're dropping salvation. The Hercules dropped altitude, engines roaring against the storm as Ghost lined up for an approach that existed only in her mind. Lightning split the sky as Ghost brought the massive aircraft into the canyon, her wingtips clearing the rock walls by margins measured in feet rather than yards. The Hercules bucked against wind shear that threatened to slam them into mountainsides, but her hands remained steady on the controls, reading the aircraft's movement like a language only she understood. 2 minutes to drop zone, Rodriguez called out, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his white-knuckled grip on his armrest. Ghost, I'm showing crosswinds at 40 knots. This is beyond our operational parameters. Through her headset, she could hear the increasing intensity of gunfire below. Valdez's voice cut through the static, desperation carefully controlled but unmistakably present. Ghost Rider, we're down to our last magazines. They're moving up the slope. We need that resupply now. Ghost's mind worked with the mathematical precision of a computer and the intuition of an artist. Wind vectors, aircraft weight, drop calculations, and terrain analysis merged into a solution that existed only in the space between heartbeats. She'd learned this kind of flying during her early days as a young lieutenant in Iraq, when survival meant trusting instruments over instinct and instinct over everything else. Load master, prepare for emergency drop. We're going in on manual release. Master Sergeant Williams and her team moved with practiced efficiency, attaching static lines and checking restraint straps on pallets that would mean the difference between rescue and catastrophe. Each bundle contained precisely calculated supplies, ammunition, medical gear, communication equipment, and most importantly, the psychological ammunition of knowing they weren't alone. "Ma'am, we're 1 minute out," Williams reported. "Winds are pushing us off target. We might overshoot." "Negative," Ghost's voice carried absolute certainty. "We're putting those supplies exactly where they need to be." The Hercules shuddered as she dropped flaps and reduced power, the massive aircraft suddenly flying more like a glider than a transport. Through the storm, the infrared beacon below pulsed like a mechanical heartbeat, the only thing visible in a world that had been reduced to violence and weather. 30 seconds, Rodriguez announced. Below them, the Taliban had reached the base of Recon 7's position. Muzzle flashes lit the canyon like deadly fireworks, and the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed off stone walls with the finality of a closing door. Ghost's finger hovered over the drop release. In her mind, she could see the trajectory, the wind compensation, the exact moment when physics and courage would intersect. Release, release, release. The cargo bay doors opened into chaos. 4 pallets tumbled into the storm, each one trailing a parachute that immediately caught the vicious crosswinds. From the cockpit, Ghost watched her calculations play out in real time, each bundle fighting against forces that threatened to scatter them across miles of hostile terrain. But Ghost hadn't spent 8 years flying combat missions by accepting defeat. As the supplies descended, she worked the rudder and throttles like a conductor directing an orchestra, adjusting the aircraft's position to create wind shadows and air currents that would guide the falling pallets toward their target. "Impact in 15 seconds, Williams called from the cargo bay. "Bundles are tracking. Tracking. Ghost, you beautiful crazy woman, they're going to land right on top of them." The first pallet hit the ground 20 meters from Valdez's position, close enough for Chen to sprint out under covering fire and drag back magazines of ammunition. The second bundle landed with medical supplies that would keep Corporal Morrison alive long enough to see his daughter's 3rd birthday. The third brought communication gear that would allow them to coordinate their eventual extraction. The fourth pallet never made it to the ground. A Taliban RPG, fired from a ridge position invisible in the storm, connected with the falling supplies in a burst of orange flame that lit the canyon like daylight. The explosion rained burning debris across both sides of the firefight, momentarily silencing the guns as everyone sought cover from the falling fragments. Recon 7, Ghost Rider 77, how copy on the resupply? Valdez's voice came back strong, renewed by the miracle of fresh ammunition and the knowledge that someone up there was crazy enough to fly through hell for them. Ghost Rider, beautiful drop. We're back in the fight. You just bought us time, but we still need extraction. Ghost stared down at the canyon, her mind already working on the next impossible problem. The storm wasn't letting up, and no helicopter could navigate these winds. But the Hercules wasn't just a cargo aircraft. It was also capable of landing on unprepared surfaces if the pilot was skilled enough and desperate enough to attempt it. Recon 7, stand by. We're not done yet. Rodriguez turned to stare at her, reading the intention in her eyes. Ghost, tell me you're not thinking what I think you're thinking. She was already bringing the aircraft around for another pass, studying the canyon floor with the intensity of a surgeon examining a patient. Tom, you ever heard of the Khe Sanh landings in Vietnam? Those were legends, urban myths. Nobody actually landed a C-130 in a combat zone that small. Ghost's smile carried the weight of history and the promise of legend. Then I guess it's time to make some new legends. The canyon floor stretched below them like a natural airstrip designed by a malevolent god. Roughly 800 meters long and perhaps 60 meters wide, it was bordered by sheer rock walls that would turn any landing attempt into a controlled crash. The surface appeared relatively flat, but Ghost knew that appearances in combat zones were usually lies wrapped in hope. Engineer, give me a systems check, she commanded, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd made impossible decisions before. I need to know every system's status before we commit to this. Technical Sergeant Kowalski's hands flew across his instruments, reading out numbers that would determine whether 8 men lived or died. Ma'am, we're showing green across the board, but I've got to ask, are we seriously considering landing in a canyon that's barely wider than our wingspan while taking enemy fire? Sergeant, I've landed on aircraft carriers in typhoons and dirt strips in Iraq, with mortars falling around the runway. This is just another day at the office. Ghost's eyes never left her instruments as she calculated approach angles and emergency abort procedures. The question isn't whether we can do it. The question is whether we're willing to accept the alternative. Below them, the firefight had intensified. The resupply had given Recon 7 new life, but Taliban reinforcements were pouring into the canyon from 3 directions. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly strobes, and the sharp crack of rifle fire echoed off the walls with increasing frequency. Recon 7, Ghost Rider 77, we're coming down to get you. Prepare for immediate evacuation on my mark. Valdez's voice carried disbelief mixed with desperate hope. Ghost Rider, say again, did you just say you're landing? Affirmative, Recon 7. Clear me a runway and prepare for the shortest takeoff you've ever seen. Ghost began her descent, fighting crosswinds that threatened to slam the massive aircraft into the canyon walls. The Hercules responded to her touch like a living thing, engines adjusting automatically to her throttle inputs, while she read the wind patterns in the way debris swirled across the canyon floor. Ghost, Rodriguez's voice was steady but strained. We're showing gusts up to 55 knots now. That's beyond emergency landing parameters. Tom, parameters are suggestions. Physics is law, and physics says if we come in fast enough and steep enough, we can make this work. The approach required every lesson she'd learned in 8 years of flying missions that other pilots called impossible. Too steep, and they'd slam into the ground with enough force to scatter wreckage across half the canyon. Too shallow, and they'd never stop before hitting the far wall. The margin for error existed only in the space between heartbeats and the gap between prayer and physics. Lightning revealed the landing zone in stark detail, as Ghost committed to final approach. The Hercules dropped toward the canyon floor like a controlled meteorite, its four turboprops screaming against the storm as Ghost fought to maintain an approach that existed at the absolute edge of aerodynamics. Through her windscreen, she could see muzzle flashes from both friendly and enemy positions, the entire canyon lit by the deadly fireworks of modern warfare. 100 feet, Rodriguez called out, his voice steady despite the death grip he maintained on his armrest. 50 feet. Ghost were coming in hot. The ground rushed up to meet them with the inevitability of gravity and the promise of either salvation or catastrophe. Ghost pulled back on the yoke, flaring the massive aircraft at the last possible moment as the main landing gear kissed the rocky surface with an impact that rattled every rivet in the airframe. Immediately, she threw the props into reverse thrust, the engines roaring like caged thunder as they fought to stop 37 tons of aircraft before physics demonstrated the permanence of Newton's laws. The Hercules bounced and bucked across the uneven surface, its landing gear absorbing impacts that would have crippled lesser aircraft. "Reverse thrust, maximum," Ghost commanded, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals to keep the aircraft centered as it decelerated through what felt like controlled violence. "Load master, prepare for combat loading. We've got maybe 2 minutes before this place gets too hot." Master Sergeant Williams was already lowering the cargo ramp as the aircraft slowed, creating a doorway into salvation for 8 men who'd been measuring their lives in ammunition counts. The ramp touched the ground with a metallic clang that was immediately drowned out by the increased volume of gunfire as Taliban fighters realized what was happening. "Recon 7, Ghostwriter 7-7, we're on the ground. Move, move, move." Valdez didn't need the encouragement. His team bounded toward the aircraft in a tactical movement that covered the 200 meters between their position and salvation in less than 30 seconds. Chen carried the radio equipment while Morrison, despite his wounds, provided covering fire that kept enemy heads down during their most vulnerable moment. But the Taliban weren't about to let an American aircraft escape their trap. RPGs began streaking across the canyon, their warheads leaving trails of light that painted deadly geometry against the storm-dark sky. "Incoming rockets," Williams shouted over the intercom. "We've got RPGs targeting the aircraft." Ghost's hands never left the controls, engines spooled up and ready for a takeoff that would redefine the concept of short-field operations. "Get them aboard. We leave in 60 seconds whether we're ready or not." The first RPG impacted 20 meters to their left, showering the Hercules with rock fragments that rang against the aluminum skin like deadly hail. The second rocket streaked past the nose so close that its exhaust trail fogged the windscreen with superheated gases. One by one, Recon 7 bounded up the cargo ramp and into the relative safety of the aircraft's belly. Valdez was the last man aboard, turning to spray covering fire across the canyon as Williams raised the ramp with mechanical urgency. "All aboard," Williams announced. "We are buttoned up and ready for departure." Ghost released the brakes and pushed the throttles to full power. The Hercules lurched forward, accelerating across the uneven canyon floor as enemy fire intensified around them. Through her instruments, she could see they had perhaps 600 meters of runway remaining, barely enough for a normal takeoff, impossibly short for an aircraft loaded with 8 additional passengers and flying in crosswinds that threatened to turn their wings into sails. "V1, Rodriguez called out as they reached takeoff decision speed. Past this point, they were committed to flight or catastrophe, with no middle ground available for doubt or hesitation. Ghost pulled back on the yoke, feeling the Hercules fight for altitude against forces that seemed determined to keep them earthbound. The aircraft clawed its way into the storm-dark sky, clearing the canyon rim by margins measured in feet, while Taliban fighters below emptied their magazines at a target that had just redefined the meaning of impossible. "Positive rate of climb," Rodriguez announced, his voice carrying relief mixed with awe. "Ghost, I don't know how you did that, but we're airborne." Behind them, the canyon fell away into darkness, leaving 8 rescued soldiers and a legend that would be retold in ready rooms and briefing halls for decades to come. But for Ghost, it was just another mission completed, another group of Americans brought home alive. Overwatch Ghost Rider 77, package delivered. Recon 7 is safe and en route to base. The radio crackled with responses from controllers who'd been following the impossible mission. Voices carried tones of disbelief, admiration, and professional respect for a pilot who just demonstrated that the word impossible was merely another challenge to overcome. But it was Valdez's voice that cut through all the radio chatter, speaking for 8 men who just witnessed aviation history. "Ghost Rider 77, from all of us, thank you. We won't forget this." Ghost's response was characteristically simple, carrying the quiet professionalism that defined the best military aviators. "Recon 7, just doing our job. Glad we could help." As the Hercules climbed towards safer altitude, Rodriguez turned to study the woman who just performed a miracle with aluminum and jet fuel. "Ghost, in 15 years of flying, I've never seen anything like that. How do you make the impossible look routine?" Ghost's eyes remained fixed on her instruments, reading the data that would guide them safely home through the storm. "Tom, impossible is just a word people use when they haven't figured out how to do something yet. Every mission is just a series of problems waiting for solutions." The return flight to Bagram Airfield gave Ghost time to reflect on the mission that would reshape her career and redefine her legend. The rescued soldiers sat in the cargo bay, their conversation mixing gratitude with amazement as they processed what they'd just experienced. Chen couldn't stop talking about the precision of the supply drop, while Morrison kept shaking his head at the audacity of landing a C-130 in a combat zone. But it was Valdez who understood the deeper significance of what had happened. As a 20-year veteran, he'd seen enough military operations to recognize the difference between standard procedure and extraordinary leadership. What Ghost had accomplished wasn't just skilled flying. It was a demonstration of the principle that American forces never abandon their own, regardless of the obstacles. "Ma'am," he said, approaching the cockpit during the flight, "I need you to know something. What you did back there, it's going to be talked about for a long time. But more than that, it's going to change how people think about what's possible." Ghost turned to face the sergeant who'd trusted her with 8 lives. "Sergeant, every pilot in the Air Force would have done the same thing." "No, ma'am, they wouldn't have. Because most pilots would have looked at that weather, looked at that canyon, and decided it couldn't be done. You looked at the same situation and figured out how to do it anyway." The conversation was interrupted by radio chatter from Bagram Approach Control, vectoring them toward a landing that would mark the end of a mission, but the beginning of a legend. As they descended through layers of storm clouds toward the lights of the airfield, Ghost reflected on the series of decisions that had led to this moment. Every pilot faced moments when training, instinct, and judgment converged into choices that defined careers and lives. The decision to fly into weather that had grounded other aircraft. The choice to attempt a resupply drop in impossible conditions. The commitment to land in a combat zone that existed at the margins of aviation safety. Each decision had built upon the previous one, creating a chain of impossibilities that had somehow resulted in 8 men going home alive. Bagram Tower, Ghost Rider 77, requesting priority landing. We're carrying wounded personnel and low on fuel. Ghost Rider 77, Bagram Tower. You're cleared for immediate approach, runway 21. Emergency vehicles are standing by. And Ghost, the whole base has been monitoring your mission. Outstanding work. As the Hercules touched down on Bagram's runway, Ghost felt the satisfaction that came from missions accomplished and promises kept. But she also sensed that something had changed, both in how others perceived her capabilities and in how she understood her own role as a military aviator. The aircraft rolled to a stop near the medical facility, where ambulances waited to transport the wounded members of Recon 7. As the cargo ramp lowered, Ghost watched 8 soldiers walk away from an experience that should have ended very differently, their survival a testament to the principle that impossible was just another word for untested. Word of Ghost's Canyon landing spread through military aviation channels with the speed of legend and the weight of verified fact. Within hours, the mission had been dissected, analyzed, and documented by flight safety officers who struggled to categorize an operation that existed outside normal parameters. The official after-action report would describe the mission in clinical terms: weather conditions beyond operational limits, terrain unsuitable for aircraft operations, enemy activity in the landing zone. But the unofficial version, the one told in ready rooms and pilot lounges, spoke of something else entirely: a demonstration that the right pilot with the right aircraft could redefine the boundaries of possible. General Patricia Hayes, commander of the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing, called Ghost to her office 3 days after the mission. The general's reputation for straight talk and clear thinking had earned her respect throughout the Air Force, and her summation of Ghost's Canyon operation would influence how the mission was remembered. "Captain Sinclair, I've been flying military aircraft for 25 years, and I've seen some remarkable aviation. But what you accomplished in that canyon wasn't just remarkable, it was paradigm-shifting." Ghost maintained the respectful attention of a junior officer receiving feedback from a superior, but her mind was already analyzing the implications of the general's words. Paradigm shifting suggested that the mission had meaning beyond the immediate rescue of 8 soldiers. "Ma'am, the mission was successful because we had the right aircraft, the right crew, and soldiers on the ground who deserved every risk we took to bring them home." General Hayes studied the young captain whose actions had just redefined what was possible in combat aviation. "Captain, false modesty doesn't serve anyone. What you did required exceptional skill, judgment, and courage. More importantly, it demonstrated something our enemies need to understand: American forces will go anywhere and overcome any obstacle to protect our people." The conversation that followed would shape the next phase of Ghost's career, as the general outlined plans to expand tactical airlift operations into scenarios previously considered impossible. The Canyon landing had proven that skilled pilots flying the right aircraft could operate in environments that traditional doctrine declared off-limits. "Captain, I'm recommending you for the Air Force Cross for your actions during the rescue of Recon 7. But beyond that, I want you to help us develop new tactical procedures based on what you learned in that canyon." Ghost understood that she was being asked to help write the next chapter of military aviation, transforming a single mission into doctrine that could save lives in future operations. The responsibility was both honor and burden, requiring her to analyze and communicate the decision-making process that had made the impossible routine. 6 months later, Captain Evelyn Ghost Sinclair stood before an audience of military aviators at the Air Force Weapons School, delivering a lecture that would be studied and referenced for decades. The title of her presentation was simple: "Redefining Operational Limits: Lessons from Canyon Landing Operations." But the content was revolutionary, breaking down the psychological and technical barriers that separated possible from impossible in combat aviation. Ghost walked her audience through each decision point of the mission, explaining the risk assessment process that had guided her choices and the aircraft capabilities that had made success achievable. "The question isn't whether the mission is dangerous," she told the assembled pilots. "Every combat mission is dangerous. The question is whether the risk is justified by the outcome, and whether your skills and equipment give you a reasonable chance of success. The lecture hall was silent as Ghost described the final approach into the canyon, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd proven her theories under the most demanding conditions possible. She spoke of wind patterns and terrain analysis, of aircraft performance and crew coordination, but underneath the technical details was a more fundamental message. We don't abandon our people, not because the weather's bad, not because the terrain's impossible, not because the enemy's shooting at us. We find a way because that's what we do. The applause that followed wasn't just appreciation for a well-delivered lecture. It was recognition from professional warriors that they just heard something that would change how they approached their own impossible missions. Among the audience was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a veteran pilot who'd been flying combat missions since the early days of Operation Enduring Freedom. As she listened to Ghost describe the canyon landing, Mitchell realized she was witnessing the emergence of a new type of military leader, someone who didn't just execute missions but redefined what missions were possible. After the lecture, Mitchell approached Ghost with a proposition that would further expand the impact of the canyon rescue. "Captain, I'm putting together a new tactical airlift squadron focused on special operations support. We need pilots who understand that impossible is just another mission parameter to overcome." The conversation that followed would lead to Ghost's assignment to the 123rd Special Operations Squadron, where her canyon landing techniques would be refined, taught, and applied to missions that pushed the boundaries of what tactical airlift could accomplish. The rescue of Recon 7 had been the beginning, not the culmination, of a career that would redefine military aviation. But on that day in the lecture hall, surrounded by pilots who understood the weight of life-and-death decisions, Ghost simply answered questions about wind patterns and approach angles, breaking down the impossible into components that other aviators could study, learn, and eventually master. The final question came from a young lieutenant whose eagerness reminded Ghost of her own early days as a pilot. "Ma'am, how do you know when a mission is truly impossible versus just really difficult?" Ghost's answer carried the wisdom earned through 8 years of combat flying and one unforgettable night in an Afghan canyon. "Lieutenant, if American lives depend on it, impossible is just another word for challenge. You keep flying until you find a way because the alternative is unacceptable." 2 years after the canyon rescue, the name Ghost had become synonymous with missions that redefined possible. Her tactical innovations had been incorporated into Air Force doctrine, her training methods were being taught at military flight schools, and her influence on combat aviation was being felt from Afghanistan to Syria to wherever American forces needed to reach the unreachable. But for Ghost herself, the most meaningful measure of success wasn't the decorations or the recognition. It was the messages she received from soldiers who'd been brought home by pilots using techniques she'd developed. Each rescue mission that succeeded, because someone had learned to see possibility where others saw impossibility, represented the true legacy of that night in the Afghan canyon. Staff Sergeant Marcus Valdez, now promoted to Sergeant First Class, sent Ghost a photograph from his daughter's high school graduation. The note attached was simple. "Ma'am, she's graduating because you brought me home. Thank you for showing us what's possible when someone refuses to accept impossible." Technical Sergeant Mike Kowalski, the engineer who'd questioned the sanity of flying through the storm, had become one of Ghost's strongest advocates, training new aircrew members in the system's management techniques that made extreme operations survivable. His briefings always included a slide showing the weather conditions from that night, with the caption, "This is what's possible when skill meets determination." Master Sergeant Patricia Williams had been promoted to Senior Master Sergeant and was now training the next generation of load masters in precision drop techniques that turned supply missions into lifelines for ground forces. Her students learned not just the mechanics of cargo deployment, but the philosophy that every bundle dropped represented someone's hope of going home alive. Major Tom Rodriguez, promoted to lieutenant colonel and now squadron commander, kept a photograph of the canyon landing in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that leadership sometimes meant following someone brave enough to attempt the impossible. The broader impact of Ghosts Canyon rescue extended far beyond individual careers and promotions. The mission had demonstrated capabilities that changed how military planners approached seemingly impossible scenarios, leading to new tactics, techniques, and procedures that expanded the reach of American forces. In Syria, Ghost's techniques enabled the evacuation of a special forces team surrounded by ISIS fighters, using a strip of desert highway as a runway. In the Philippines, her innovations allowed the delivery of humanitarian supplies to typhoon victims in terrain that had been declared inaccessible. In Africa, her methods facilitated the rescue of embassy personnel from a city under siege. Each mission built upon the foundation established that night in Afghanistan, proving that the Canyon rescue hadn't been a single moment of exceptional aviation, but the beginning of a new understanding of what was possible when skill, courage, and determination converged. The techniques Ghost developed were eventually codified in Air Force Manual 32, Special Operations Airlift Tactics, with an entire chapter dedicated to extreme environment operations. Military flight schools added her canyon landing to their curriculum as a case study in risk assessment and mission execution under adverse conditions. But perhaps the most significant legacy was cultural, the understanding that impossible was not a permanent condition, but a temporary obstacle waiting for the right combination of skill and determination to overcome it. As Ghost prepared for her next assignment, a promotion to major in command of her own squadron, she reflected on the night that had changed her career and influenced an entire generation of military aviators. The Canyon rescue had lasted less than 4 hours from first radio call to safe landing, but its impact would be measured in decades and in the lives of soldiers who would come home because someone had learned to see possibility where others saw only impossibility. Standing in her quarters at Bagram Airfield, packing the few personal items that had accompanied her through 8 years of combat deployments, Ghost paused to examine the single decoration she'd chosen to keep on her desk, not the Air Force Cross or the Distinguished Flying Cross, but a simple challenge coin given to her by the soldiers of Recon 7. One side bore the unit insignia of the reconnaissance team she'd rescued. The other carried an engraving that captured the essence of her legacy. Ghost, she proved impossible, was just another word for untested. The coin represented more than personal recognition. It symbolized the principle that had guided her career and would continue to influence military aviation long after her name was forgotten. In a profession where the difference between success and failure was often measured in seconds and inches, Ghost had demonstrated that the boundaries of possible were limited only by the imagination and determination of those willing to test them. As she prepared to leave Afghanistan for her new assignment, Ghost understood that the Canyon rescue would always be remembered as the moment when impossible became routine. But for her, it had simply been another night's work, another group of Americans who needed to come home, another challenge that required a solution, another opportunity to prove that the word impossible had no place in the vocabulary of those who served. The transport aircraft that would carry her to her next assignment was a C-130J Super Hercules, identical to the one she'd flown into the canyon 2 years earlier. As she conducted her pre-flight inspection, Ghost ran her hand along the aircraft's aluminum skin, feeling the